to China, where the Gobi Desert grows by about 3,000 kilometers each year.
When news first broke that China was burying straw and planting trees deep in its deserts, the world rolled its eyes. Environmentalists warned it would fail.
We have doubts about the possibility, the viability of this idea.
Scientists called it wasteful. Critics laughed at what seemed like a desperate, misguided effort to green the ungreenable. How could you possibly grow forests in sand? For years, skeptics pointed to the failed plantings and mocked China's ambition. But behind the scenes, something extraordinary was taking shape. Quietly, patiently, and relentlessly. And now, 10 years later, those same critics regretted it. The environmental crisis that fueled the dream. Before the world watched China plant forests in the desert, it was watching something far more alarming, a country slowly being swallowed by sand. Desertification, the degradation of fertile land into arid, lifeless desert, was not just an environmental inconvenience for China. By the late 20th century, it had become a full-blown national emergency, threatening food security and human survival in vast swaths of the country. The roots of this crisis stretched deep. In the decades following the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949, population growth and industrialization led to a dramatic rise in land exploitation.
The sand dust comes mainly from land which has been destroyed in 4 ways.
Overgrazing by livestock, aggressive deforestation to meet wood demands, and unsustainable farming techniques weakened the land's ability to retain nutrients and moisture. Soil erosion worsened as protective vegetation disappeared, and strong northern winds swept across the exposed land, carrying away the topsoil essential for life. The result was staggering. By the early 2000s, it was estimated that more than 2.6 million square kilometers, over 27% of China's landmass, was affected by desertification. The most critically impacted areas were found in northern and northwestern China, including Inner Mongolia, Gansu, Ningxia, and Xinjiang, where the once grassy steppes and farmlands were rapidly turning into barren sands. Perhaps most terrifying was the Taklamakan Desert, known as the Sea of Death. As one of the largest sandy deserts in the world, it had already claimed entire ancient trade routes and towns in centuries past. But in modern times, it was expanding, pushing eastward, threatening infrastructure, and fueling powerful sandstorms that choked cities like Beijing and Tianjin. In 2006 alone, China experienced 17 major sandstorms, with dust clouds traveling as far as South Korea and Japan, and in some instances, even reaching the west coast of the United States. Beyond the environmental toll, the human cost was profound. An estimated 400 million people lived in or near desertified zones. Crops failed, wells ran dry, villagers were displaced from ancestral lands. Whole communities in Hebei and Inner Mongolia were forced to relocate, making China one of the few countries with government-acknowledged ecological migrants, people whose homes were no longer viable due to environmental collapse. This crisis also presented a political dilemma. For a rising global power determined to show technological and economic strength, such widespread environmental degradation posed a threat not just to its people, but to its credibility on the world stage. China needed a solution, not a bandage, but a bold, visionary project capable of reversing decades of damage. It was out of this existential crisis that the idea of building a green Great Wall, a vast man-made forest to stop the advance of the deserts, began to take shape. And so, in the face of sandstorms and skepticism, China unveiled one of the largest ecological engineering projects in human history. China's ambitious plan unveiled. Faced with the mounting crisis of desertification, China's leadership realized that incremental efforts would not be enough. What was needed was an unprecedented, large-scale environmental strategy, and in 1978 they launched it. Known officially as the 3 North Shelter Forest Program, but often referred to as the Great Green Wall, this mega-project would become the most extensive afforestation campaign in human history. The vision was audacious. Plant a massive belt of trees across the arid and semi-arid regions of northern China, spanning the 3 regions of northeast, Dongbei, north, Hubei, and northwest, Hebei, hence the name 3 North. The goal was to construct a living, breathing barrier against the expanding deserts, particularly the Gobi and Taklamakan, which were creeping steadily toward more densely populated and agriculturally productive areas. Designed to unfold in 8 phases across 73 years, from 1978 to 2050, The plan aimed to rehabilitate over 35 million hectares, approximately 87 million acres, of degraded land. Its intended forest zone would stretch more than 4,500 kilometers in length and 1,500 kilometers in width, forming a massive arc across China's northern frontier. But this wasn't just a tree planting campaign. It was a national mobilization. The project blended top-down central planning with grassroots participation. Local governments were given mandates to plant and protect forests, while national policies offered incentives for participation. Beginning in the 1980s, the government rolled out measures like the Grain for Green program, which compensated farmers for returning eroded farmland to forest or grassland. Citizens were encouraged, and sometimes required, to contribute, with tree planting quotas in schools, workplaces, and military units. Even the cultural sphere was engaged. In 1981, China instituted National Tree Planting Day on March 12th, a holiday that inspired mass participation in afforestation efforts. It helped drive the momentum of the project and turned it into a patriotic act of environmental restoration. As the initiative matured, the government began investing in scientific research, monitoring systems, and satellite-based tracking to oversee forest health, plant survival rates, and ecological impacts. The scope of the project was immense. New species had to be selected that could withstand arid conditions. Irrigation systems were tested and adjusted, and innovative solutions like straw checkerboards and soil conditioners were introduced in later phases. Importantly, the Great Green Wall wasn't confined to forests alone. The strategy incorporated agroforestry, grassland restoration, shrub zones, and desert-resistant crops to ensure long-term viability. Planners understood that a diverse ecological approach would be more resilient than monoculture forests. By the early 2000s, aerial imagery began to show promising results. Patches of green were emerging across previously barren land. Despite high failure rates in some areas and persistent skepticism, the campaign continued, slowly, steadily, and with a growing sense of national pride. But even as China pushed ahead with determination, the world, and many experts, still viewed the plan as quixotic, naive, and doomed to fail. Laughed at by the world. While China's Great Green Wall project drew attention for its ambition, it also became the subject of international mockery, skepticism, and scientific criticism. Planting trees in the desert, one of the harshest environments on Earth, was widely regarded as an ecological fantasy. Many experts, both within China and abroad, believed the project was destined for failure. The early years of the campaign did little to inspire confidence. Satellite images from the late 1980s and 1990s showed that large portions of newly planted forests had withered and died. Entire swaths of desert plantations had turned into ghost groves, bare, dry, and lifeless. Critics pointed to alarmingly high tree mortality rates, with estimates ranging from 50% to as high as 85% in some zones. These numbers were devastating for a project of this scale, and only reinforced the narrative that China was fighting a losing battle against nature. Environmental scientists raised serious concerns. Many of the trees being planted were non-native species, such as poplar and pine.
Yeah, I think overall it's a good idea. So this project was launched in 1978. We have started to observe some positive results,
which lacked the natural hardiness required to survive in arid conditions. Without adequate water, nutrients, or biodiversity, these monoculture forests were vulnerable to disease, pests, and drought. Furthermore, they argued, planting the wrong species could degrade the soil even further and create long-term ecological imbalances. Rather than restoring the land, critics warned, China might be replacing one environmental disaster with another. Public commentary was equally brutal. International media often portrayed the project as green theater, a symbolic effort more concerned with optics than results. Headlines in Western outlets cast doubt on the project's scale and sincerity, while some labeled it a waste of public funds. Foreign development experts questioned China's reliance on mass mobilization and top-down mandates, arguing that such efforts were unsustainable without deeper environmental reforms. Even within China, there were voices of dissent. Some local ecologists criticized the campaign for over-prioritizing quantity over quality, celebrating the number of trees planted without tracking how many actually survived. Others warned that in some areas, tree planting was reducing water availability for nearby farmlands and river systems. The desert, it seemed, was not so easily tamed, and many doubted that any amount of planting could hold it back. Metaphorically and literally, the world laughed. The phrase, "burying money in the sand," became a common barb, symbolizing how foolish and futile the effort seemed. China, for a time, became a case study in misguided environmental ambition, an example of how not to green the planet. Yet despite the laughter and criticism, China did not give up. Instead, it doubled down on its efforts, sending teams of workers and scientists into the desert to begin what would become the most unlikely environmental transformation in modern history. The technical execution begins. While the world ridiculed China's dream of turning deserts into forests, thousands of workers, engineers, and volunteers quietly rolled up their sleeves and got to work. The early stages of the Great Green Wall were not driven by sophisticated technology or billion-dollar budgets. They were powered by persistence, ingenuity, and simple but effective tools that could function in some of the harshest conditions on Earth. One of the most ingenious methods pioneered during this phase was the straw checkerboard technique. Developed in the 1970s by Chinese desert researchers, it involved laying bundles of straw in a grid pattern across sand dunes to create a stabilizing framework. These straw grids, usually 1 meter by 1 meter, significantly reduced wind speed at the surface and prevented sand from shifting. Over time, the checkerboards also helped retain moisture, encourage the accumulation of dust particles, and allowed hardy desert plants to take root. The raw material for these grids came from an unlikely source: China's vast rice industry. Each year, the country produced over 200 million tons of leftover rice straw, a farming byproduct that was often burned or discarded. In desert regions, however, it became a lifeline. Workers hauled truckloads of rice straw into the desert, spreading it manually across vast swaths of shifting dunes, especially in critical areas such as the fringes of the Taklamakan Desert, where sand regularly threatened roads, villages, and railways. At the same time, National Tree Planting Day became a cornerstone of China's mobilization efforts. Over time, it became a national tradition. Between 1982 and 2021, an estimated 78.1 billion trees were planted by volunteers. Schools, military units, government offices, and civic organizations took part, turning the event into a visible sign of China's environmental commitment. The actual planting process was grueling. Workers dug holes in unforgiving soil, often working under extreme temperatures with limited access to water. In many regions, irrigation had to be improvised using tanker trucks or hand-dug trenches. Since many desert soils lacked organic content, soil amendments like compost, clay, and loam were sometimes added to increase water retention. These early years were about laying the foundation, both literally and figuratively, for future success. While not all trees survived, the straw checkerboards began to anchor the dunes. In some pilot zones, sand movement was reduced by up to 99.5%, allowing planted vegetation to cling to life. The process was slow and highly labor-intensive, but it was working, 1 square meter at a time. Yet, as workers toiled in the sand, new challenges emerged. The hostile environment was unforgiving. Tree survival rates remained dismally low, and critics only grew louder. The desert, it seemed, was far from defeated, and the hardest days were still to come. Struggles, setbacks, and more doubt. Despite the early momentum of China's Great Green Wall campaign, the challenges of taming the desert soon grew more formidable than anyone had anticipated. The deserts China was trying to green were not passive stretches of land. They were dynamic, hostile environments shaped by centuries of wind, drought, and shifting sands. The Taklamakan, Gobi, and other major deserts received as little as 10 millimeters of rainfall annually, with some areas going months or years without meaningful precipitation. Temperatures could swing wildly, from scorching 45 degrees Celsius summers to minus 20 degrees Celsius winters. This made tree survival extraordinarily difficult. In many of the early afforestation zones, young saplings planted during tree planting drives died within the first year. The soil, loose, sandy, and lacking nutrients, could not hold water. Even where irrigation was deployed, the moisture quickly evaporated or drained away. In the worst-hit regions, up to 85% of trees failed to survive. particularly those planted in monocultures like poplar or pine, which weren't adapted to desert conditions. Compounding the ecological issues were logistical and economic challenges. Transporting water, straw, and seedlings into remote desert areas required massive manpower and government subsidies. Seasonal sandstorms often erased months of work in a single afternoon, burying trenches, uprooting saplings, and scattering straw grids. Forest farms struggled to maintain operations. Local governments, eager to meet planting quotas, sometimes prioritized quantity over quality, leading to haphazard execution and inconsistent results. These failures attracted intense criticism. Chinese media began to question the validity of the project, and international publications doubled down on their skepticism. Environmentalists warned that the strategy of mass planting, especially in monocultures, was ecologically unsound and could actually make the situation worse. Studies warned that the water used for afforestation could deplete groundwater supplies, harming agriculture and communities. Even some government scientists began to reconsider the project's direction. In academic forums and policy papers, they raised concerns about sustainability, biodiversity loss, and the long-term feasibility of turning deserts into forests. One influential 2011 report from the Chinese Academy of Sciences called for a rethinking of desertification control strategies, urging a shift from tree planting to natural ecosystem restoration. And yet, in the face of mounting doubt, China persisted. Instead of retreating, policymakers and scientists began to reassess and innovate. They acknowledged the flaws in early approaches and started to invest more heavily in research, trial and error experimentation, and local adaptation. The Great Green Wall entered a new phase, one marked by smarter, more efficient, and more ecologically sound solutions. Out of this hard-earned humility came a technological evolution. The failures had taught China valuable lessons, and the next steps would reshape how the desert was fought, not with brute force, but with engineering, science, and nature in harmony. Engineering a solution, deeper innovation. After years of hardship, dead saplings, and public scrutiny, China realized that brute force planting was not enough to conquer the desert. The country needed smarter, adaptive techniques, methods grounded in both traditional ecological knowledge and modern engineering. What followed was a strategic pivot that would breathe new life into the Great Green Wall and transform it from a struggling campaign into a model of environmental innovation. One of the most pivotal advancements was the mechanization of straw grid construction. Initially laid manually by workers under harsh desert conditions, the straw checkerboards had proven effective at stabilizing dunes and retaining moisture, but the manual process was slow and labor-intensive, limiting how much land could be covered. In response, Chinese engineers developed automated trench digging and straw-laying machines, which dramatically accelerated deployment. These machines could lay grids up to 4 to 6 times faster than human labor, allowing for rapid scaling of desert stabilization efforts. Alongside mechanical innovation came ecological refinement. The government abandoned its reliance on fragile, fast-growing monocultures like poplar and eucalyptus, which had proven ill-suited to desert climates. Instead, they turned to native and desert-adapted species. Plants such as saxaul, tamarisk, wolfberry, goji, sea buckthorn, and drought-resistant grasses were introduced into the planting scheme. These species were better equipped to survive long dry periods, and they played a crucial role in building resilient, self-sustaining ecosystems. China also invested in soil improvement technologies. Researchers began experimenting with biochar, microbial inoculants, and organic compost blends that helped poor desert soil retain water and nutrients. In some zones, small-scale drip irrigation systems were installed to maximize water efficiency. In others, mycorrhizal fungi were added to soil beds to improve root uptake and plant survival. At the infrastructure level, the integration of environmental engineering reached new heights. Notably, the BTU Lanzhou Railway, constructed through a section of the Tanger Desert, used a combination of straw checkerboards, windbreak forests, and gravel belts to protect tracks from being buried by sand. This method was later applied to a new high-speed highway through the Taklamakan, which had long been considered unbuildable due to harsh shifting dunes. These methods weren't just about planting trees. trees. They were about designing the desert itself to support life. Strategic vegetation corridors were established between sand dunes to trap dust, block wind, and reduce soil loss. Satellite monitoring and drone-based surveys were introduced to track vegetation health, detect weak spots, and adjust strategies in real time. What emerged from this evolution was a more balanced, integrated approach, not forests for the sake of trees, but resilient ecosystems tailored to China's unique deserts. It was a transformation built on failures, recalibrated through science, and executed with determination. Now, the world that once mocked these efforts would witness something extraordinary. Within just 10 years, the desert began to bloom, and those who doubted China's vision would be forced to reconsider. 10 years later, they regretted it. 10 years after critics mocked China for burying straw in the sand, the world began to see a transformation that few thought possible. The very deserts once viewed as irreversible wastelands were showing signs of life, stability, and even prosperity. What had once been dismissed as an ecological fantasy had become a case study in success, and those who had laughed were now left to reconsider. In 2024, China reached a landmark milestone, the completion of a 3,000-kilometer greenbelt encircling the Taklamakan Desert, one of the harshest and most feared deserts on Earth. This feat alone silenced many doubters. Where shifting dunes once threatened to swallow villages, roads, and railways, now stood stabilized sand anchored by straw grids, native vegetation, and self-sustaining ecosystems. From 2016 to 2020 alone, China had already converted 21.7 million acres of desert into green land. By 2024, the total number of hectares reforested since the project began had exceeded 30 million, increasing the nation's forest coverage from just 10% in 1949 to over 25%. Entire regions that were once plagued by chronic dust storms, such as Inner Mongolia, Ningxia, and parts of Xinjiang, reported drastically reduced frequencies and intensities of sandstorms. Urban areas previously shrouded in yellow haze during spring now enjoyed clearer skies and healthier air. Perhaps the most visually striking evidence came from satellite images. Aerial photos and satellite data captured vibrant ribbons of green spreading across the northern deserts, forming protective corridors around infrastructure, farmland, and communities. These images, which had once shown lines of dead trees and gray wasteland, now revealed checkerboards of straw and green growth, stretching for hundreds of kilometers. The BTU Lanzhou Railway, once predicted to be buried by the desert within 30 years, remained fully operational, protected by the very methods once ridiculed. Similarly, the high-speed highway that cut through the Taklamakan was a functioning reality, bolstered by gravel barriers and vegetation belts. What had been deemed impossible in the early 2000s was now a visible triumph of design, patience, and ecological perseverance. Beyond the environmental transformation, there were tangible economic benefits. Formerly barren regions had opened up to ecotourism, with travelers eager to see the desert forest corridors. In some areas, locals began cultivating goji berries, grapes, and desert-resistant herbs, turning previously abandoned land into productive agricultural zones. Government incentives for sustainable farming created jobs, reduced poverty, and brought stability to fragile communities. Internationally, environmental organizations and desert-prone nations began to take notice. China was no longer a punchline. It was a reference model for combating desertification through innovation, adaptation, and massive-scale planning. But China's triumph wasn't just a national victory. Its impact extended beyond its borders, reshaping environmental thinking on a global scale and proving that even the harshest landscapes could be reclaimed. A global model of transformation. What began as a bold domestic experiment has now become a globally recognized environmental success story. China's battle against desertification not only reclaimed vast stretches of once-lost land, but also reshaped how the world understands ecological resilience, large-scale reforestation, and the power of national commitment. From 2000 to 2017, NASA satellite data revealed a surprising trend. Despite widespread deforestation elsewhere, global green cover was increasing, and China alone accounted for more than 25% of that growth. The Great Green Wall played a pivotal role, alongside parallel afforestation campaigns and sustainable land management reforms across the country. The result was a stunning reversal in China's ecological narrative, from degradation and despair to renewal and leadership. This transformation also had measurable environmental impacts. As vegetation spread across once barren deserts, carbon sequestration increased, helping China offset emissions and improve its standing in the global climate fight. Wind erosion and dust storm frequency dropped, allowing improved agricultural yields and reducing respiratory health issues in affected regions. Reforested areas began to support microhabitats, birds, insects, and small mammals, signs of early biodiversity returning to restored ecosystems. But perhaps more importantly, China's techniques began to inspire other desert-prone countries. Nations in Africa's Sahel region, Central Asia, and the Middle East started examining China's model for their own reforestation efforts. The integration of low-cost materials like rice straw, community participation through tree planting holidays, and machine-assisted afforestation methods proved replicable across different geographies. Chinese experts were even invited to collaborate with the African Union's Great Green Wall initiative, aiming to stretch Greenland from Senegal to Djibouti. At home, pride surged. Chinese media outlets shared images of once lifeless landscapes now teeming with plant life. Comment sections filled with amazed citizens reflecting on their country's transformation. As one viral post put it, they said it couldn't be done. But look at this. Only in China can you witness a desert bloom like this. It became a slogan of sorts, symbolizing not just environmental success, but the spirit of national determination. The economic benefits continued to grow as well. Regions along the restored belts began attracting eco-tourists from around the world. Travelers ventured into Inner Mongolia and western Gansu to witness the desert forests and the innovative sand control infrastructure. Meanwhile, formerly marginal land was now supporting sustainable agriculture, producing desert-grown grapes, herbs, and berries for both domestic and export markets. China's ability to blend tradition and technology, local participation and national policy, science and scale, all in service of reclaiming its environment, has now become a model that others hope to emulate. It serves as proof that with vision, patience, and relentless adaptation, even the most seemingly hopeless landscapes can be revived. The world laughed when China began burying plants in the desert. A decade later, those same voices fell silent. As the sands gave way to forests, the doubt gave way to awe, and a once ridiculed dream became a global inspiration. What do you think about China's green walls? Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.